Hey there, good morning. Welcome to Next Level Play Therapy. If you're watching live, I would love to know who's here. Post your name in the comments, where you're from, what population you work with. Are you using Sandtray? Here's a question that comes up all the time, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, whenever I do in-person Sandtray trainings, and the occasional time when I do online Sandtray trainings, the question about sand always comes up. And that's one of the reasons why I thought this would make a good episode for the weekly live stream, or if you're listening on the podcast, a good episode for the podcast, because the question comes up all the time. So, it's a good question, actually. So I thought that would be something we talk about today. And if you have questions, please feel free to post those. Um, let's have a conversation. The only thing that I ask is not to pose specific questions about clients, just because it's a public format and this is really a live stream a podcast for play therapists who just to kind of support you and give you ideas and things to think about, really to take your play therapy skills to the next level. So I've been in the child and adolescent field for over 30 years now, and specifically using play therapy for over 20 now. So I really, along the way, have really learned a lot of things, and I kind of enjoy sharing those with the next generation of play therapists. So that's the purpose of this weekly live stream. And if you're listening to the podcast. So, welcome. Today, we are going to talk about what kind of sand is best for your sand tray. And I remember, this is a couple decades ago now. I remember I was just starting to figure out how to get play therapy training and find people who knew how to do it, because I had been introduced to it back in the late 1980s, and I had been on my journey to find out how to do it. Took me it took over 10 years to find that. But I remember when I went to my first Sandtray training, and I figured out how to do it. We did our own sand trays. I was transformed by the end of that training. That sand tray in play therapy was absolutely amazing and magical. And so I set out to use it myself. And like many of us, when we're first getting started, it's expensive. Getting started, setting up your playroom, and then getting all those miniatures and the sandbox, the sand tray. And so I opted to get the less expensive sand, the cheap sand, I call it. And I got my Tupperware or Rubbermaid container to use for the sand tray, and off I was. But what I quickly realized as my clients began to use the sand tray was that children love to sift and pour and move it around and sift and pour. They love to pour the sand. And what would happen is they do all this moving of the sand and mixing it, and then there would be this like cloud of dust hovering in the air over the sand tray, and I would be coughing and my clients would be coughing. And then for me, I have clients all day long, and then we'd have this cloud of dust all day long. So at some point I thought, this is terrible. This is not going to work, because time after time after time with my cloud of dust in the air, I found myself beginning to hate sand tray and dreading when my clients wanted to use it and do their pouring. So then I invested in some different kind of sand. So I think that's one of the reasons this topic comes up a lot about what kind of sand is best, because we're really trying to figure out what, how to make sure we have a good experience for clients using sand tray. And so today I'm going to share some tips that I've learned over the last 20 plus years, specifically using sand tray in the play therapy process. So let's get started. First of all, dustless is best. As you probably would have figured, I was going to say, based on my description of my experience prior to dustless sand, it was horrendous. Cheaper sand is usually pretty dusty. And then, so the thing about sand tray therapy, so using sand tray in play therapy, or just using sand tray therapy in your clinical practice, if you're using it with adults maybe, or even adolescents, the thing about the sand tray process is it's the experience that our clients have of it. So their experience of the symbols, also known as miniatures, their experience of the sand and the container, which is the sand tray. It's their experience of that and how they use that experience for healing. So think about it. The experience of the sand is going to make a difference. So if there's a ton of dust, it's not a really good experience. And some children, they're extra sensitive to things like that. So they might even not be able to tolerate it physically, be able to tolerate it. So there are different options other than the cheaper sand, which you can get for, I don't know, it might be $5 a bag now here in the US. I'm not exactly sure how it is. It's usually the sand you get for the outdoor sandbox that you use with little kids, or in the home improvement stores, maybe they use that particular kind of sand to mix concrete or something like that. It's very, very dusty. So there are some other options. If you are in the play therapy world, or maybe even the sand tray world, or maybe even the early childhood education world, because you might have heard of Jurassic sand. So Jurassic sand, their sand is more expensive, and it is not dusty. So it's the quality. You're going to pay for quality, because what they have to do in order to ensure the quality is high. So I always recommend, if you can afford it, especially in the beginning, if you can afford it, you might as well invest in some really good sand and use Jurassic sand. If you were watching last week, maybe it was a couple weeks ago. What is today? The 17th, where I am. Yeah, it was a couple weeks ago. I posted a replay from my YouTube channel about an episode I did, I think it was a couple years ago now, with Jurassic sand, where they kind of walk through some of the sand that they have. You can always pop over to their website, Jurassic sand, and check out their sand. And there's another option as well. I call it kind of the middle ground option. It's not quite as expensive as Jurassic sand, and it's not as dusty. It's not anywhere near as dusty as the I'll call it the cheap sand. It can be a little bit dusty. I haven't experienced it to be too bad. I know in some of the sand tray trainings that I've had, Some people have said that they do find it a little too dusty for them. And that's the Santastic sand, which you can buy on some of the play therapy supply sites online. The Santastic sand is, you can get it in different colors, and they have white. I think I call white the starter sand. That's typically what most people start with, but not always. So it's kind of a more of a middle. If you can't really afford the Jurassic sand, then I would recommend starting with the Santastic sand. The other question I get asked a lot is, what about the kinetic sand? So that kinetic sand is it's not wet sand, it's moldable sand. Um, and so it kind of acts like wet sand, but it's not wet sand because you can mold it. And the molding process is really nice. The only thing that I don't like about kinetic sand, because I used it for a little while, but then decided I just could not tolerate the mess. And what it did to the, I mean, it would like glomp onto the miniatures, and the more little nooks and crannies you had in your miniatures, the more it would get kind of stuck in there, and you'd have like this white pasty kind of plastery feel to some of your miniatures sometimes if you didn't get them cleaned really, really well. So I think some people have mixed feelings. Some people really like the kinetic sand. Some people like me do not like the kinetic sand. I'd rather just make water available and manage the water rather than use the kinetic sand. So really, it's more about preference. But these are some of the options that you have. The next question that I get asked a ton in my in-person sand tray trainings is like, what kinds of sand should you use? So I kind of mentioned some of them already. So do you use wet sand, do you use dry sand, or the kinetic sand? And think about it this way. The sand tray making experience, like I said, is really about the experience for the builder of the sand tray. And so it's going to be unique to each builder. Some people will like the dry sand, some people will like the wet sand, some people will like the kinetic sand. It's more about what kind of experience do you want to be able to offer your specific client population. But I would also say it's kind of like, what do you align with? What works for you, and that you're comfortable as the therapist providing this experience? What kind of experience do you want to provide as well, including what experience do you want to provide for your clients? So there's pros and cons of each. The wet sand is awesome because you can mold it. The only thing that's not awesome about the wet sand is it gets all your miniatures really dirty. And then but the other thing is, like I've had this where I'll share some tips about if you want to use wet sand and dry sand, some tips for that. Well, one of the things that I would find happen, especially if you only have one sand tray, you might have a child who wants to use wet sand. And so they use wet sand. And then the very next client, I've had this happen so many times. The next child would come into your office and look at the sand tray and give you a look like, what have you done to the sand tray? Like it's wet. Why did you allow someone to destroy a perfectly good dry sand tray? They don't say it that way, but the look on their face and the words they use, which are pretty much along the lines of, why did you let somebody do that? Like disgust. Like, what's wrong with you, Miss Kathy, that you would do this really dumb thing? So that's the only thing, how do you manage that if you only have one sand tray? Your clients may not, a a pro and a con. A pro in terms of if you have clients that want to use wet, you can give them the opportunity to use the wet sand. If you have clients who don't like wet sand for their sand tray making process and they only want to use dry sand, then only allowing a dry sand tray will will make more clients happy. And those, what I found is if you don't want to use a wet sand tray, kids will do fine with the dry sand tray. The kinetic sand, the pro about that is that it is moldable. And so your clients who want to mold and they want to create, they want to use the sand molds to create those castles and different kinds of shapes in the sand. That's an option. The con is that it's really messy and it kind of, like I had mentioned, kind of creates challenges for your miniatures, what they look like if you don't get them really cleaned afterwards. So once it gets dried and caked on there, it can be not make your miniatures not look so awesome. But if you want, so here's the thing, if you have the ability to have two sand trays, and you have a wet sand tray and a dry sand tray, one of the things you have to keep in mind is if they're using miniature, so a lot of times kids, if you have two sand trays, a lot of times kids want to use both of them in the session. So you have to figure out how you're going to manage that. And here's why. From my experience, what'll happen is the wet sand will get on the miniatures and they'll use those miniatures with the wet sand in the dry sand. And so then you get all these, it kind of creates all these different little sand balls in the dry sand. It's not that big of a deal. And some kids don't like it. It really just depends. It's such a really individualized thing. I like to mention the pros and cons just because from experience and over the years, these are just different things that I've found. So when you're in your decision-making process, you can think about what works best for you. Plus, the other thing is if you work with children who have a lot of tactile sensory processing issues, then you're also going to want to think about what type of sand you're using. And if you have options, then they can choose. But if you don't, then kids will figure out a way to get what they need. If that's, if you just don't have too many children on your caseload who have a lot of sensory, but maybe you have one or two and you don't have the option for creating, for offering other opportunities, you have other things in the playroom where they can get their needs met. So it really just is like you kind of thinking it through, what works best for my space, what works best for my wallet, my bank account, and what works best for my client population, and what works best for me. I don't like a lot of mess. Like the kinetic sand, I gave it a good run, but it was just so darn messy, and I could not tolerate having to clean it up in between sessions when I was like, you don't have a lot of time in between sessions to clean up, and I got tired of rushing. That was the reason. So here are some tips though. So if you want to use water in your sand tray and you only have one sand tray, my suggestion would be just have some limits around it. Have like a measuring cup. Here in the United States, we say cups. Outside of the United States, you use milliliters, and liters, you use different measurements, but essentially like 2 cups. You don't want to use more than that. And so if they want to use that much water you allow them. You say, the rule is you can use enough water to fill this cup, and this is the amount of water you can use. That is plenty to get the sand wet. Because here's the other thing that can happen, and this did happen. And again, pros and cons, right? So years and years and years and years and years and years ago, when I was just getting started building a group practice, because I was solo practice for a while, and then I owned a group practice. I don't have that anymore. And so we shared an office, like most of us do. And the other therapist who was using play therapy with her clients, and her client wanted to use sand trays. So it was the other therapist's day. It was her clients. And we had a plastic sand tray, a really big one. And her client needed to use a lot of water in the sand tray. So she flooded it. I mean, it was like an inch of water in the sand tray. So, but the therapist described to me what powerful work this client had done in such a regressive way with this really watery sand tray. And it was just so awesome. I was so excited that her client had this experience, that this therapist had experienced this amazing work her client had done. But here's the problem with that. It was like an inch. I am not kidding you, like an inch of water in that sand tray, which means it took days to dry. And after about 3 days, because my clients would come in, some of them would come in and say, cool. And I had other clients that would come in and look at it and give me the face like, what have you done? Miss Kathy, why did you allow this? And they just could not get over it. And, it takes a while to dry. So it's not like you can get it back to the state really quickly. So what I ended up having to do, I was on the first floor and we had a little patio and there's a big grassy area outside. So I ended up having to take the sand tray outside and pour off all the water. And I left it outside for a little while just to dry a little bit more because it was summertime. And then that way it was back to like normal wet sand. And then it would dry. So if you use like 2 cups, it'll dry by the next day. It'll typically be dry again. The other thing is though, some sand doesn't do well getting wet. So you have to think about the kind of sand that you have and what's going to happen if you get it wet. Like I know I've used in the past, I used Sandtastic for the black sand because Jurassic Sand wasn't selling it anymore. And I was so sad. And it got like this film over it. It didn't really, because it was made up of different material, the way it interacted with the water wasn't the same as if I had gotten the white Sandtastic sand wet. It wasn't the same experience in the water. And then some of the Jurassic sand, because it's made up of different textures, you can get it wet. Some of them you can get wet. Some of them, like I think there's 1 or 2, probably don't want to get wet. They talk about that. If you go, they have a YouTube channel. Jurassic Sand has a YouTube channel. They also talked about it when I did that live stream episode. So if you wanted to watch that, we talked about that in the episode. You can always pop over to my YouTube channel. Or if you're in my Facebook group, just go up to the featured section and scroll through all the replays. So you want to think about that if you're going to use wet. Here's the other thing, and this was a tip that I got years ago when I did my first sand tray training. because I did not think about this. So I always like to try and pass on this information. If you're choosing to use wet sand, then you 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 want to think about it, be mindful of what happens to that sand when you allow your clients to wash their hands in the sink to get their hands cleaned, and when you wash the sand tray miniatures in the sink to get them cleaned. Because in the sink, you have that little U, the pipe will do that like little U and S curve to it. What'll happen is the sand accumulates at the bottom. And so after a while, it'll clog up your sink and you'll have to call the plumber. So there are different ways to manage that. Like I always used to keep a clean bucket of water in the playroom and some paper towels. And so I would just myself, because I'd usually be in the sand tray with them, and my client, we would kind of dip our hands, clean our hands in the water to get all the sand off and then dry off. And then if they wanted to use soap and water, then they could do that in the sink. And then I would also use that water to clean in the bucket to clean off the sand from the miniatures. And then I would let them dry. Again, you have to think about what your miniatures are and whether or not they can get wet. So if they can't get wet because it will destroy them, you may not want to allow those to be available for that sand tray if they're using a wet sand tray. So those are just some tips if you do want to use the wet sand when you're thinking about using wet sand versus dry sand. And the last question I always get when I am providing sand tray trainings, and here's one of the reasons I love, to me, if you're going to learn sand tray therapy and how to use it, at some point, you really need to do an in-person sand tray where you are getting your hands in the sand, using miniatures, creating that world in the sand. So you have the full experience of the textures and the movement and symbols and using the symbols and what gets accessed with the symbols. Because I can't tell you how many times, and I've been doing in-person sand tray trainings for many years now. And one of the things that I always find is that by the end, and usually I'll do a 2-day training where we do tons of experiential sand tray making and processing. By the end of those 2 days, what becomes really clear is the experience of different textures and how that creates a different healing process, the color of the sand, and how the builder experiences that. And so the question that comes up is, colored sand, does it matter? And I say yes and no. So most time, and here's what I mean by that. Yes, because it does influence the experience of the sand tray making process for the builder. And no, because if you don't have the opportunity and you only have one sand and you want to go with a more neutral sand, your clients will get what they need in order to facilitate the healing process. So I say that so people don't get too overwhelmed and hung up on it. Start where you start and see where you go. I mean, that's the best way to do it. So colored sand, Jurassic sand has a lot of different colored sands and textures to their sand. And I love using Jurassic sand. I love having those different textures available, having the different colors, because during the sand tray training process, you'll see people use different colors and different textures. and the experience that they have with that. Like I remember when I went to my first sand tray training, and then there were lots of different colored sands and textures available. But for me, it was a little overwhelming, just like from like a emotional kind of sensory experience. The whole process was new to me to begin with. And this whole idea of all these miniatures and all this different sand, and you want me to do what? And so for me, I just needed something a little more neutral to get started. So I started with the white, but I would go to sand tray trainings all the time. There's on the East Coast, there was a really wonderful person who did a lot of sand tray trainings, and so I went to hers all the time. And as I started to really enter into the sand tray making process, for training as well as I liked them because I got to do some of my own personal work. I just plopped the Kleenex next to me and did my thing. But what I began to realize is I would use different colors and different textures to have a different experience for whatever it was that I was working through. This is true for your clients as well. So I say that to say, does colored sand matter? Yes and no. Yes, because it does influence their experience. And no, because it's not uncommon. Maybe clients need to have a more neutral starting point. And so they need a little more neutral sand color, something that's more reminiscent of the beach, which is what they're used to, something like white or some kind of beach colored sand. So it's really boils down to, when you're considering colored sand versus not colored sand, it really boils down to the experience of the builder and the sand tray. That includes the textures and the color. And if you only have a limited budget and you only have limited space, it's okay to start with whatever color you'll start with. I would suggest getting something a little more neutral because it'll appeal to more of your clients. And then you can always build from there, add to your sand tray making supplies, so to speak. So those are just some things to think about. If you like, Sandtastic has a lot of different colored sands as well. So you may want to have different colored sands available for your clients. Here's a little tip though, something you need to think about. Because I've had wet and dry sand tray available. I've also had different colored sand in sand trays available. So multiple sand trays. So here's the tip. Do you remember what I said about the wet and dry? Well, that's also true for colored sand. If you have more than one sand tray in your playroom available, it's not uncommon clients want to use more than one sand tray. And you can allow that, or you can just make it a rule. We're only going to use one, and here you can only pick one. It just depends. This is all how you want to manage this. Because here's what happens. If you have, let's say, like this, I would have a white sand tray, and then I would have a sand tray with a different color. And then what would happen, they'd use both. And then what would happen, they'd use miniatures in the colored sand, and then those would go in the white sand. And then the white sand, they'd use that, and the sand would get on those miniatures. And then this white sand would get in the colored sand, and then it would get mixed. And it would look like when you allow your clients to mix Play-Doh. It's like it then, and you can't unmix it at that point. There's no unmixing. You're either going to be comfortable with having multicolored sand in your sand tray, or you're going to have to figure out how to manage that. I like to keep things separate because it's expensive, and having to buy things over and over and over just is expensive. And I don't like that. So Anyway, so that is it for today. Let me do a quick recap on today's episode. Think about the sand as grounding the symbols in the container. The experience of the sand in and of itself is grounding. And so then you're also having your clients use the symbols to ground in the sand tray. But clients like the texture, the experience of the sand in and of itself can be soothing. And it's also how they ground those symbols as they do the work that they're about to engage in. So you really want to invest in sand that's going to create that healing experience for the builder. Cheaper sand, while I totally get it, and I started there as well, it is easier on your bank account, but in the long run, it creates a terrible experience because of the terrible dust. Like every once in a while, I've heard from people where they got the cheap and expensive sand and it was not dusty. So if that's the case, that's amazing. But for most people, the cheaper sand that you have available to purchase is really, really dusty and it is not a pleasant experience. So I would always recommend investing money to get a better quality of sand. Sandtastic is not as dusty as the cheaper sand. Jurassic sand is the most expensive, but it also does not have dust, so you don't have to worry about it. So it's a better quality. And then the second thing is your ability to use wet sand versus dry sand versus kinetic sand. And the ability, there's pros and cons for each of those: wet sand, dry sand versus kinetic sand. The ability to move the sand and mold the sand can be a really awesome part of that healing experience. And the question of, in my mind, the question of wet sand or dry sand or kinetic sand really can come down to practical issues, meaning, do you have the money? Do you have the space? And how are you going to handle how much water is allowed in there? Or how are you going to handle cleaning up after the kinetic sand? Managing to make sure you don't clog your sink, getting the miniatures cleaned, and whether or not you want to have both available or all three available really depends on a lot of those practical issues. I think all of them have benefits to them, and all of them have some things that are lacking. It really boils down to where do you want to prioritize things and what makes the most sense for your practice and your clients. And then the third thing is colored sand. The color of the sand does influence the sand tray making experience and the process. And it can be expensive. So again, how you manage colored sand versus more neutral white sand is really going to boil down to practical issues as well. And then also, if you choose to have more than one sand tray with different colored sands, how are you going to manage when kids want to use both and they're mixing up in the sand, and now you don't have two different colored sand trays, you have two sand trays with multicolored sand. So you'll want to manage that as well. And a lot of the Jurassic sand is different colors, and the different colors have different textures to them. So you get the texture part as well as the color part to it. Sandtastic sand has mostly the same texture, different colors. So you can think about what makes the most sense for you. So that is it for today. If you're interested, I did want to let people know I do have a sand tray training coming up. Registration is closing soon. It's going to be in southern Utah, in St. George, Utah. It's 2 days. in the sand tray. We do have some kind of didactic learning. A lot of it, I really try to focus on where you're building sand trays, we're processing, we're using that experience to learn what to look for. How do you know it means what it means? And how to hold that process so that you are not getting in the way and derailing it. So if you're interested, I do have another sand tray training coming up this weekend, Saturday and Sunday, July 20 and 21 in Southern Utah. If you're interested, it's called Sand Tray in Play Therapy with Children and Adolescents. You can pop over to my website at rhplaytherapy.com/courses. So Renewing Hearts Play Therapy Training, go to the courses page and look for the training, the in-person training, Sand Tray in Play Therapy with Children and Adolescents. If you're not able to make it to Southern Utah this time, keep an eye on my website because I will have some more trainings coming up. I'll have some more sand tray coming up in the future. I also have some live webinars. There's also some other pre-recorded courses on there. So, all righty, that is it for this week, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.